It started with a knock that didn't sound like a neighbor's. Not a friendly rap, not the awkward double tap of a delivery driver. No, this knock came heavy. Intentional. The kind that makes the walls hold their breath. I'd been living in that house for 22 years. 2 decades of morning coffee on the same porch, of fixing the same squeaky stair every winter, of planting tomatoes in the backyard because my late wife, Marianne, always said tomatoes grown in sun and silence tasted better. So when I opened the door that morning, I wasn't expecting 3 men in matching dark jackets standing shoulder to shoulder on my porch, arms crossed, sunglasses glinting despite the cloud cover. "Mr. Halpern," one of them said. "Yes," I answered, gripping the screen door just enough to brace myself. "We're here on behalf of the Silvercrest Homeowners Association. We're issuing a legal directive for you to vacate the premises within 72 hours. He handed me a folder thick printed and sealed with what looked like a gold emblem stamped in wax. "This," he continued, "is a warrant. A warrant from the HOA. I blinked, then looked down at the document. It was dressed up like something real legal phrasing, numbered clauses. Even a signature at the bottom in official-looking cursive. But one detail stopped me cold. The name on the signature line, Judge Ethan Halpern. My son. My only son. They didn't know that, of course. They didn't know the man whose name they'd forged had once built a treehouse in the backyard they were now trying to seize. They didn't know that while they were holding up faux legal paperwork, like it was gospel, the real Judge Halpern was preparing to come visit his father that very weekend. I looked up at the man who'd handed me the folder. "This is fake," I said. He smirked. "You're welcome to contest it through official HOA review procedures, but I'd advise cooperation. Once the 72-hour window closes, we have the right to initiate a forced removal under the terms of your community agreement." "That's not how any of this works," I replied. The man took a step closer. "It is here." I felt my jaw tighten. "You mind if I make a quick call?" I asked, stepping back into the house before they could answer. Inside, I dialed faster than I had in years. Ethan picked up on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay?" "Ethan, I need you to listen carefully. There are 3 men on my porch. They're claiming to be HOA enforcement. They just gave me a warrant with your name on it." A beat of silence. "What did you say?" I scanned the document again, reading the fine print. It's labeled as Notice of Compulsory Relocation, Judicial Mandate, signed Judge Ethan Halpern, 14th Judicial District. They want me out in 72 hours. Another pause. Then in the calm tone he only used when adrenaline hit, "Do not speak to them again. Do not sign anything. I'll call the sheriff's department right now, and I'll be on the next flight down." I stepped back onto the porch folder, still in hand. "You boys might want to hold off on your little operation. The judge whose name you just forged, he's my son, and he's on his way." The smirk slipped off the man's face like a mask torn mid-scene. They didn't say another word. They turned and walked briskly to a dark SUV idling at the end of the driveway. The driver stared straight ahead as they climbed in. Within seconds, they were gone. But the paper remained, and with it the realization that this wasn't some clerical error or overeager neighborhood volunteer. This was a coordinated attempt to force me, an aging veteran widower and longtime homeowner, off my own land, and they thought they could get away with it. Ethan arrived less than 24 hours later. He came straight from the airport to my house, still in his dark blazer, court tie loosened, but dignity intact. The moment I handed him the document, he sat down at the kitchen table and read every line like he was back in chambers. After 15 minutes, he closed the folder and pushed it away. "This isn't just illegal," he said. "It's dangerous." "How so?" I asked. "They're not bluffing anymore. This language, they've moved beyond HOA policy. They're simulating judicial authority. If someone else had received this, someone older, less connected, they might have packed up and left." I nodded. "That's probably what happened to June Carter." He looked up. "Who's that?" "My neighbor. Same HOA. Moved out last month after paperwork issues with her property line. She was too scared to fight." He rubbed his temples. "We need to do more than fight back. We need to burn this down, legally speaking." I smiled. "That's the son I raised." The next day, we started digging. Ethan filed a formal complaint with the District Judicial Ethics Board regarding unauthorized use of his signature. He flagged it as judicial impersonation, an offense that could carry both state and federal implications if proven. While that process churned through its gears, he contacted a few friends at Kamaksimshas at the county recorder's office and legal aid network. Within 48 hours, we had enough to know this wasn't an isolated incident. 5 other homeowners had received similar relocation warrants, all within the past 6 months. All were older residents. 3 had sold and moved. 2 had complied with emergency HOA mediation and paid hefty fines to stay in their homes. All of it under the threat of legal force that did not and had never existed. The names on the forged documents, they varied. Some listed Judge P. Anderson, a name Ethan recognized from the state judicial archives, but who had been retired since 2012. Another bore the name of a family court magistrate, who coincidentally lived 2 counties away and had never heard of Silvercrest. But mine was the first one that used an actual living currently seated judge's name, Ethan's. That was their fatal mistake, because now we had standing. Now, this wasn't just elder abuse or community harassment. This was fraudulent impersonation of a judicial officer. And Ethan wasn't going to pursue it as a son. He was going to pursue it as a jurist. By the time we reached the county clerk's office that afternoon, Ethan had already organized a stack of documents that could make a grown lawyer sweat. He wasn't just furious, he was methodical, controlled. The kind of furious only a judge could be, every ounce of rage pressed into precision. He wore his courtroom voice like armor, and it didn't crack even once as we walked into the records division past a receptionist who tried to tell us we needed an appointment. "We're not here to wait," Ethan said, his tone calm measured. "We're here to verify legal filings bearing my forged signature." That stopped everything. The clerk, a young woman in her 20s, looked from him to the badge number on his lanyard, then motioned us into a side room. 10 minutes later, an official from the county registrar joined us. A man in glasses and a houndstooth vest who looked more like a university librarian than someone who'd been keeping the legal records of the county for 2 decades. Ethan laid the fake warrant on the table between them like it was a loaded weapon. The man read it, adjusted his glasses, then read it again. Then he shook his head. "There's no filing number, no court seal, no entry in our system under this title docket or directive. And the format this reads like someone tried to recreate a real order using a PDF editor and too much confidence." Ethan leaned in. "Look at the signature." The man's eyes paused on the bottom line. He blinked. "That's you." Ethan nodded once. "It is. Or rather, it's supposed to be. But you didn't sign this." "No." And what's worse is that 5 other residents received similar documents, all with fabricated judicial references. Some of them had seals. Some didn't. They're inconsistent, sloppy, but they're working. The clerk looked visibly shaken. This could mean criminal impersonation of the judiciary. It already does. We spent the next several hours filing formal complaints. Ethan insisted that every affidavit include a full timeline, when the warrant was served, by whom, under what conditions. I remembered each moment clearly. The man's voice, the smug posture, the way he handed me the paper like it was both a gift and a threat. Ethan printed copies of the forged documents and annotated them, line by line. I watched him switch from son to state official in seconds. He wasn't just documenting lies, he was hunting them. When we left the building that afternoon, the sun was already lowering behind the courthouse dome, casting long shadows down the marble steps. But something had shifted. The fear was gone. It had been replaced by momentum. We got in the car and sat there quietly for a moment. Then Ethan said, "They've done this more than once. That's not ignorance. That's a system." He turned to me. "Dad, we're not just going after some fake paper here. We're going after the people who built an entire machinery of intimidation." That night, I called Rosa, my neighbor, 2 doors down. She answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. "Hi, Mr. Halpern. Everything okay? Have you ever gotten a letter from the HOA that looked legal?" There was a long pause. "You mean like the eviction notice? What did it look like?" "Big envelope, gold seal. Said something about community enforcement compliance." I was scared to open it. I paid the fine right away. "Do you still have it?" I think so, somewhere in the kitchen drawer." "Don't throw it away. I'm coming by in the morning." When I hung up, I looked at Ethan. "That's 2 people now, Rosa and June." He nodded. "Let's make it 20. So we made flyers. Not angry ones, not even accusatory. Just a simple request. Have you received legal-looking documents from your HOA that mention enforcement, compliance, or removal? You may have been the target of a fraud scheme. Please contact us. We printed 50 copies. We walked the neighborhood that weekend side by side, father and son. People answered their doors more readily when they saw Ethan, his calm face, his tone of reassurance. They trusted him, even if they didn't know yet why they should. And by Sunday night, we had 8 homeowners who said yes. Yes, they'd received compliance orders with threats of fines, liens, or even removal. Yes, they'd felt helpless. Yes, they'd paid. One woman, Susan, cried as she showed us her letter. They said I was behind on HOA dues, but I wasn't. I even had the receipts. They told me if I didn't pay immediately, I could be removed from the community for breach of contract. And you paid it. $3,000 from my pension. Ethan took her letter, carefully scanned it on the spot with his portable document reader. It's a forgery, he said, and you're going to get your money back. She shook her head. Why are you doing this? Why would a judge care about us? He looked at her gently. Because the name they used on your letter is mine. Her eyes widened. You're the... He nodded. Yes, ma'am. I'm the judge they forged. That evening, we sat at the dining table, papers fanned across the surface like a battlefield. Ethan began organizing everything into categories: residents who received fraudulent notices, those who'd paid fines, and those who'd been threatened in person. I helped cross-reference addresses, dates, and HOA board minutes that I'd downloaded years ago out of curiosity and now read like blueprints for extortion. It was all here. Language lifted from real ordinances and twisted. Signatures stolen and forged. Elderly residents targeted because they were less likely to push back. And at the center of it all, the HOA board president, a man named Carter Voss. He'd been voted in 5 years ago, charismatic, pro-safety. He ran on a platform of revitalizing the community and restoring order. Now we saw what that meant. Aggressive HOA rule expansions. Private enforcement officers recruited from security companies with no municipal approval. And somewhere along the way, someone realized that fake warrants could move people faster than polite letters. That intimidation could be more profitable than enforcement. And that most people, especially the elderly, the vulnerable, the uninformed, wouldn't question a seal that looked real or a name that sounded legal. Not unless that name happened to belong to their son. Ethan looked up at me that night, surrounded by evidence, glowing laptop screens, and the ticking of the old clock in the corner. We're going to burn this down the right way, he said. In court. On record. You sure? I asked. He smiled. Dad, they knocked on the wrong door. Monday morning came with the sound of rain tapping softly against the kitchen windows. It was the kind of quiet drizzle that blurred the edges of everything. The roof lines, the streets, the boundaries that had long defined Silvercrest as a controlled community. But inside our house, there was clarity. Ruthless clarity. Ethan had already dressed by the time I made coffee. He wore his black trousers, a crisp shirt, and that deep navy tie that Marianne gave him when he passed the bar. The one with the tiny gavel pattern almost no one noticed but me. He looked more than ready for court. He looked like justice. You sure you want to go in today? I asked. You've got every right to recuse yourself from anything involving this case. He slid his notebook into his leather satchel and replied, Exactly. That's why I have to go in. Before anyone assumes I'm trying to control this from the bench. And with that, he left. I spent the morning fielding calls. Word had spread fast. The flyers had worked better than we expected. People had started knocking on my door now, not the other way around. Some brought physical letters. Some came with shaky voices and long stories. One man, Mr. Jeffries, brought an entire cardboard box of documentation. He'd kept everything: the fines, the threats, the compliance corrections pasted to his garage door in 2021. They told me my yard statue violated architectural code, he said, but the code they cited doesn't exist. He showed me a copy of the HOA regulation packet. On the back was a handwritten note, unsigned, remove before final review. This is your last warning. I sent the entire file to Ethan. He didn't reply. He was in chambers, but at 2:12 p.m., the county court system issued a press bulletin. Judge Ethan Halpern has recused himself from any judicial rulings involving the Silvercrest Homeowners Association. An independent review panel has been appointed. The judge has formally requested a judicial integrity audit in relation to forged documents bearing his name. It was short, direct, and absolutely devastating for the HOA. Because if there was one thing a corrupt board feared more than a lawsuit, it was scrutiny from above. The kind of scrutiny that wasn't subject to neighborhood elections or volunteer committees. The kind of scrutiny that came from people with subpoena power. People who weren't afraid of knocking back. When Ethan returned that evening, he looked exhausted but lighter. He dropped his satchel on the entry bench, kicked off his shoes, and poured himself half a glass of wine. "How'd it go?" I asked, handing him a plate of Marianne's old meatloaf recipe from the freezer. He took a long sip before speaking. "I met with the presiding judge and the regional administrative director. We reviewed the document. They both confirmed it was not only fake, but dangerously so. The seal on it is a poor copy of the county's official emblem from a version used 5 years ago. It's been out of circulation since the last update. That's how we know it was copied and reused." He took a bite, chewed, and continued. "They're bringing in the state inspector general's office. This is going above us now." I sat down slowly. "And what about Carter Voss?" Ethan's face darkened. "He's retained counsel, denies everything. Says the warrant was a rogue action from a third-party vendor working under broad interpretation of the HOA's compliance policy." I laughed out loud. "So, he's blaming imaginary henchmen for his imaginary court order." Ethan smiled grimly. "Pretty much." Then his eyes settled on me gentler now. "But Dad, this next part, it won't be quick. You understand that, right?" I nodded. Justice never is. Over the next week, the wheels began to turn. The local newspaper ran the story on Wednesday, Judge Halpern targeted in forged HOA eviction attempt. Below the headline was a photo of our house, my house, and a side-by-side image of the fake document and a real court order. The contrast was embarrassing. The real order bore seals, electronic timestamps, and case numbers. The fake one font, inconsistencies, misplaced signatures, and the use of Latin filler text lorem ipsum in 2 clause footers that no one had even noticed. Rosa called me that night laughing through her tears. "They left placeholder text in a fake warrant." "They sure did," I said, holding back my own laughter. "You really can't make this stuff up." But beneath the absurdity was something far more serious. Because each article, each testimony, each scan of a fake notice was a piece of armor stripped from the HOA's shell. People no longer whispered. They shouted. They organized. Marcus, the single dad from the next street over, created a Facebook group titled Silvercrest Legal Alliance. In a single day, over 200 residents joined. They shared screenshots, documents, letters, threats. They compared dates, names, even formatting. It became clear that the HOA had been running a pattern of coercion, not random incidents, but coordinated pressure campaigns, the kind that blurred the line between policy and persecution. And in every thread, in every conversation, someone asked the same question. How did we let this happen? The answer, of course, was simple. Fear. Compliance. Trust misplaced in a system designed to intimidate rather than serve. And no one had ever thought to challenge it until the enforcers got too bold and the name they faked turned out to belong to someone who could fight back with more than a complaint. A week later, Ethan was asked to give a private statement to the Judicial Ethics Committee. It wasn't public, it wasn't filmed. But I know what he said because I heard him practicing in the living room the night before. "It's not just about me," he said aloud. "It's about everyone who got a letter and thought it was the law. About everyone who packed their bags without a fight. This is not just impersonation. This is predation. And if they're doing it here, they're doing it elsewhere." That word predation hung in the air. He didn't just want accountability. He wanted precedent, a ruling that said, clearly HOAs are not above the law. They don't get to issue pretend warrants. They don't get to forge signatures or act like cops or displace people in the name of order. They're neighborhood managers, not kings. The next morning, while Ethan was at the courthouse, I sat on the porch with a neighbor named Henry. He was 92, Wabutu vet, a man who'd been fined 3 times in the past year for non-conforming lawn furniture. He sipped his tea and looked out at the street. "Your boy," he said quietly. "He's doing something real. He's doing something right," I said. He nodded. "There's power in paper, you know. Wars have been started by less, but there's power in people too. You just have to wake them up." He tapped the folder beside him, the copy of his violation letters now sealed in an envelope for the DA's office. Well, he said, "Guess it's time to wake up." And in that moment, I realized something. This fight was never just about my house. It was about the story I'd be able to tell my grandson someday, about the day a forged paper tried to take my life away. And my son, the real judge, stood up and burned the lie to the ground. The HOA office didn't look like a headquarters for coercion. It sat quietly between a dry cleaner and a yoga studio in a strip mall built in 2003 and never updated since. But now, every time I passed it, the blinds seemed a little more closed, the door buzzer a little more delayed, and the receptionist inside a little more nervous when anyone walked in who wasn't there to pay a fine. But I wasn't walking in to pay anything. I was walking in to expose. Ethan and I decided that the best path forward wasn't a public confrontation, not yet. We needed information, documentation, leverage. And while Ethan handled the legal side interviews, statements, judicial ethics reports, I took it upon myself to talk to the people the HOA thought they'd silenced for good. I started with the quietest street in Silvercrest, the one near the slope where no one went unless they lived there, where mailboxes leaned from decades of wind, and where the HOA never seemed to bother repainting curb numbers. That's where I found Mr. and Mrs. Bellamy. They were the first homeowners in the development, early retirees, who'd moved here in '99, when Silvercrest was still a set of brochures and promises. Their front lawn was modest but immaculate. Their porch still had an American flag, though now faded by sun and time. "Your son is the judge," Mrs. Bellamy asked, pressing a cool glass of iced tea into my hand. "He is." She sat across from me, her eyes full of something I couldn't name yet. Not sorrow, not rage. Weariness, maybe. That long-term fatigue you get when you've been dismissed too many times. 3 years ago, she began, "We got a letter saying our roof tiles were visually discordant and needed replacement. We just had them redone. Clay, same as everyone else, but we refused." A week later, we got another notice, this time for a mailbox code violation. And then came the warning fines. 200 here, 400 there. Eventually, Carter Voss himself showed up with someone he called an enforcement liaison. Said if we didn't resolve our violations, we could be reclassified as non-compliant occupants, which might jeopardize our property title. I nearly choked on the tea. Reclassified, his words. We thought it was nonsense until the property tax assessor's office called. They said someone submitted a petition to reevaluate our lot's occupancy status. It didn't go through, but it scared us. And you didn't fight it. We tried, wrote letters, attended board meetings, got laughed off the podium. She reached for a folder worn at the corners and handed it to me. Inside were copies of all the notices. And there it was again, the gold seal. This time on a notice of non-compliance conversion stamped and dated but without any legal reference numbers. No court docket, no municipal code. And at the bottom, a signature line labeled Compliance Director, Silvercrest Enforcement Division. I'd never heard of such a title. It wasn't in the HOA's founding documents. It wasn't in the community handbook. It wasn't anywhere except on these fake forms. I sent it to Ethan immediately. He called within an hour. That name, he said, appears on 4 other documents we've collected. And guess what? What? There's no such person in the HOA payroll filings. Not past or present. So it's a phantom. No, he said, voice tight. It's a role. Invented to sound official so they could forge more notices without linking them to board members directly. A mask behind a mask. And they'd been using it for years. That evening, I attended my first HOA board meeting in over a decade. Not as a complainant, not even as a resident looking for peace. I went as bait. The room was smaller than I remembered. The folding chairs were still wobbly. The air still stale from too many closed windows and not enough honesty. Carter Voss sat at the center table, his silver tie straight as a blade, his smile tighter than a bowstring. To his left, the remaining 2 board members, the treasurer and the architectural lead, both looking like they were praying for the fire to pass without burning their names. I raised my hand during the public comment portion. Carter acknowledged me with faux warmth. "Mr. Halpern, good to see you back." "Wish I could say the same," I replied evenly. The room tensed. I held up a packet. "These are copies of letters sent to residents under threat of forced removal, forged judicial endorsement, and made-up titles like Compliance Director. None of these are legally recognized. None of them follow due process. And the name signed on at least one of them, Judge Ethan Halpern, my son." A gasp rippled through the audience. "I am giving this board exactly 48 hours to produce the name of the person or persons who drafted, printed, or distributed these notices. After that, everything goes directly to the DA." Carter didn't blink, but the woman beside him did. "We'll have our legal counsel reach out," he said too calmly. "I've already spoken with legal counsel," I said. "They work for the state now." I turned to the room. "You've all seen these papers. Many of you paid money, signed documents, or changed your homes out of fear of them. But it was a game. And the only reason it worked is because no one stood up. I let that settle. Then added, "I'm standing up now." And I walked out. The next day, I received an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a USB drive. And a handwritten note, "I'm done helping them. You need to see this." I plugged it into my laptop on the kitchen table, heart pounding. It contained a folder labeled Templates Enforcement Letters, a spreadsheet titled Target List 2021-23, a PDF named Emergency Transfer Protocol Non-Compliant Occupants, and finally a video file. It opened to a grainy clip security cam footage from inside the HOA office. Carter Voss sat at a desk typing. Then he looked at someone off screen and said clearly, "Just slap Ethan's name on it." "Who's going to check the guy's a county judge? That makes it look twice as real." He laughed. So did the other voice. But I didn't, because I knew what that moment was. It wasn't just the smoking gun. It was the confession. We didn't sleep that night. Ethan arrived just past midnight, still in court clothes, his jaw locked so tight I could see the tendons in his neck twitching when he spoke. "Play it again," he said. I did. The video looped Carter Voss reclining in his chair chuckling as he told someone unseen to slap Ethan's name on it. It was casual, effortless. The tone of someone who'd done it before who didn't worry about consequences. But this time he'd said the quiet part out loud. Ethan stood silent as the video ended. Then he turned to me and said, "This isn't just forgery. This is criminal conspiracy to defraud under color of authority." He picked up the USB and dropped it into a padded evidence envelope already labeled and notarized. "I'm submitting this to the Attorney General's office in the morning." And that's exactly what he did. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. Channel 7 ran a segment called Fake Warrants, Real Victims inside the Silver Crest HOA scandal. The footage wasn't graphic, but it was damning copies of the documents' blurred faces of elderly homeowners recounting how they were pressured to leave or pay, and one short clip of the video confession. Carter's face was front and center. But what struck me wasn't just the media explosion, it was the wave of stories that followed. Letters, emails, notes slipped under our door. Each one told the same story, dressed in different names. A retired schoolteacher forced to remove the wheelchair ramp her husband had built before he died. A Vietnamese couple fined repeatedly for non-compliant shutters until they sold their home out of frustration. A widower named Sam, who'd been threatened with lien action for installing solar panels after his wife passed, panels she'd wanted her whole life. And most haunting of all, a typed letter from a woman named Lorraine. She lived 5 blocks away. Her handwriting was neat, careful, as if she'd written it slowly over many tries. "I got a notice last year. It had a judge's name on it, your son's I now know. It said I was in breach of occupancy restrictions and would be formally reclassified if I didn't vacate within 30 days. My husband was already in memory care and I was too tired to fight. I sold the house. I moved. I never stopped feeling like I'd failed. Thank you for showing me I didn't." I read the letter twice. Then I handed it to Ethan. He didn't say a word. He just held it for a long time like something sacred. We decided it was time for something bigger. So we rented the community center, the same one Carter had used to gaslight residents in town halls, and we opened the doors wide. Silvercrest Truth Forum. Bring your story. No microphones, no cameras, just us. I expected maybe a dozen people, but they came. 67 chairs were set, and we ran out. Ethan and I stood at the front. We didn't speak at first. We just listened. One by one, the residents stood and told their truths. I thought I was the only one. I thought I must have missed something in the contract. They made me feel like a criminal in my own kitchen. I almost left the state. A woman I didn't recognize, early 40s, sharp eyes, raised her hand last. "My name is Kristen," she said. "I'm a lawyer. HOA board members contacted me last year to help them rewrite the bylaw language. When I saw what they were planning, I backed out. They offered me triple my hourly rate to keep quiet." The room fell silent. Then she added I didn't take the money, but I didn't warn anyone either. That ends tonight. She walked to the table, opened her briefcase, and set down a stack of documents 3 inches high. Meeting transcripts, internal drafts, communications with Apex Compliance Consultants, LLC. It was the first time we had hard evidence of an outside contractor's involvement. Carter hadn't just manipulated his neighbors. He'd weaponized third-party companies to do it for him. Companies that existed outside the HOA bylaws. Companies that no one had ever voted to approve. 2 days later, Channel 7 released a follow-up piece with the headline, "HOA Whistleblower Provides Link to Private Enforcement Network." And suddenly, the story was no longer just about one neighborhood. It was about dozens. Same patterns, same forged seals, different zip codes. Ethan received a call from a district judge 2 counties over. Another from a retired magistrate whose name had shown up on a notice of lien intent he'd never authorized. The State Judicial Review Board called an emergency session. The Attorney General's office confirmed an open criminal investigation into HOA boards across the region for widespread abuse of process coercion, document fraud, and elder targeting. And still, more letters arrived. Some handwritten, some typed, all aching. One man sent a single sentence. "I lost my house, but I finally have my voice back." One night a knock came at our door. I opened it to find Luis, the veteran from the corner lot. He was shaking, but not from age. He handed me a small black box. Inside a fake badge. Brass, heavy. Stamped with Silver Crest Enforcement Authority. "They gave me this last year," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Said I could help keep the neighborhood safe if I wore it, and passed out letters to people who parked wrong." "Did you do it?" I asked. He nodded once, twice. Then I realized it wasn't real. But I kept the badge. I didn't know who to give it to. "You just did," I said. He pressed it into my hand like it burned. "I didn't mean to help them," he said. "I just wanted to belong." I looked him in the eye. "You still do, but now you belong to the truth." That week, the HOA board tried to host a special session to restore calm. Only 3 people showed up. Carter didn't attend. His chair was empty. And for the first time in 22 years of living on this land, I saw the truth of what we'd always been told, that power given without accountability becomes poison. But I also saw something else. Power can be reclaimed. It starts with one voice and becomes many. And when it does, no forged paper, no false badge, no polished smile can stand against it. Because truth spoken by the people who lived it is louder than fear. By the end of the 3rd week, Carter Voss had gone silent. His usual HOA broadcasts, those long self-congratulatory emails, signed, "In pursuit of excellence and order." CV stopped arriving in residents' inboxes. The official HOA website went dark for maintenance. The phones at the enforcement office rang unanswered. No one was seen entering or exiting their old storefront. It was a vanishing act, but it came too late, because by then the fire had already spread, and Ethan and I, along with Rosa Kristen Marcus and the small army of residents who had banded together, were ready to turn that fire into light. The question was how, and the answer came from someone I never expected, Angela Riordan. Once, a fierce enforcer and second-in-command to Carter, she had disappeared from the board after the story broke. Many assumed she'd lawyered up or fled like Trask, the HOA treasurer, who was rumored to have sold his house and left the state. But she didn't. She emailed Ethan directly. "I kept copies of everything. I'll share them, but only off-record. I won't speak on camera, and I won't testify unless subpoenaed. But if this thing is going to die, I want to be the one to help bury it." She met us at the town library, quiet, unassuming, a duffel bag in her hand. Inside, HOA minutes not available to the public. Drafts of legal-looking documents with Carter's handwritten notes. A payment ledger from Apex Compliance Consultants showing monthly disbursements that weren't listed in any HOA public reports. And one more thing. A thumb drive labeled Training Sessions Internal Use Only. Kristen plugged it in. We watched the first video. Carter stood in front of a whiteboard. Behind him were bullet points, written in red marker. Command presence, de-escalation by authority. Simulation, document framing techniques. He looked straight into the camera. When approaching a property, he said, "Don't ask, tell." Use phrases like, "You are now in formal violation," whether they are or not. The goal is not legal correctness. The goal is compliance through perceived legitimacy. I felt my stomach churn. The man didn't just break the rules. He built an entire philosophy around pretending to be the rule. Kristen looked at Ethan. "This is bigger than civil liability." Ethan nodded. "This is organized deception, deliberate and ongoing. And now it's on tape." We had enough for the state. But something still nagged at me. "This has to reach the people he's scared," I said. "Not just courtrooms and lawyers. The folks who folded under those fake warrants, they need to see him admit it. Not through second-hand articles. They need to see him." So we came up with a plan. It was risky, but it would be clean. We just needed to tempt Carter out of hiding with one last staged scenario. One final test to see whether he'd take the bait. Kristen made the call. She posed as a newly installed interim board member, hoping to restore order. She said she'd heard he still had documentation. The community needed paperwork only he could explain. She told him she wanted to meet discreetly at his old office, off hours, no media, no legal teams. Carter responded the same day. He agreed, and he gave her a time. Friday, 6:30 p.m. Ethan secured permission to wire the room legally. Not for prosecution yet, but for documentation. He cited civil protection laws and whistleblower safety protocols. Kristen agreed to wear the mic. I watched as she prepped. No nerves, no hesitation. Just focus. We parked across the lot and waited in my truck. At 6:29, Carter arrived. He looked the same slicked back hair, crisp blazer, too white smile. But something in his eyes had changed. Less charm, more calculation. Like a man who knew he had fewer cards left to play. Kristen met him inside. Ethan and I listened in through the wireless feed. Carter, she said, I just want to know how to clean this up. How do we explain all those letters, the warrants? He chuckled. Don't explain, he said. Reframe. Kristen stayed quiet. They never check, Carter continued. We used Halpern's name because it sounds official. People don't verify judges. They see a stamp and they obey. But the ones who didn't obey, Kristen asked, what about them? Then you shift blame. Rogue staffer, misunderstanding. Offer them a settlement. If they want more, let them sue. They won't win. The board indemnified us 2 years ago. Indemnified. That meant he thought he was personally untouchable. Ethan wrote the word down in all caps. Carter kept talking. You think this ends me? This community's full of sheep. Give it 6 months, they'll be begging me to come back and fix things. Then he added, I still have the originals, you know. The ones with Halpern's signature, the better fakes. Kristen said what we'd rehearsed. Do you still have them with you? He laughed again. Oh, honey. I never carry the ammunition, just the threat. That was enough. Ethan turned to me. It's over. Within hours, we'd submitted the audio and video to the Attorney General's field office. Kristen was given full whistleblower protection status. Angela's evidence was reviewed and archived as supporting documentation. That night, we held another gathering at the community center. But this time, it wasn't for stories. It was for truth. We played Carter's own voice on the speaker system, unedited, in full. The room was packed, standing room only. Some people gasped, others wept, but many just nodded. They already knew. They'd felt it in their bones long before the proof. And now they finally had something to hold, something to fight back with. Rosa stood up after the tape finished and said, They told us we were paranoid, that we didn't understand the rules, that we were the problem. She paused. Now we know better. The room erupted in applause, not because the war was over, but because for the first time in years, it wasn't being fought in the dark. The first arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't Carter, not yet, but it sent the loudest message the community had ever heard. Officer Hill, the lead investigator assigned by the Attorney General's office, made the announcement outside the municipal building with a simple statement. This morning, an arrest warrant was executed against William Trask, former treasurer of the Silvercrest HOA, on charges including document fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. I watched it live on Ethan's phone, standing beside him on the porch, with the morning sun barely warming the tips of the trees. There was a pause as they walked Trask out in cuffs, head down, windbreaker zipped up to hide his face. He looked nothing like the smug man who used to lecture us about grass height and mailbox placement. It was surreal. But what happened next was what truly cracked the dam. Trask didn't stay silent. He flipped. Within 48 hours, his attorneys had negotiated a deal with the state-reduced sentencing in exchange for full cooperation, all digital records, and sworn testimony against Carter Voss. And just like that, the board's protective bubble began to pop. More subpoenas were issued. Angela, now working voluntarily with the investigation team, guided them through the maze of pseudo-organizational files Carter had maintained in various compliance divisions, most of which weren't legal entities at all. Just clever names used to confuse residents. And then came the raid. They hit the Apex Compliance Consultant's office. What turned out to be nothing more than a rebranded suite in a corporate park 2 towns over. Inside, dozens of templates for enforcement notices, all pre-filled with different homeowner names. A full printing setup for court seals. An entire drawer labeled Judge Ethan Halpern Templates AD. Ethan stood beside me when they brought out the boxes. He didn't speak, but I saw it in his shoulders, the mix of shame, anger, and quiet resolve. They had used his name to terrify people, and now he would help take that terror apart one truth at a time. It was the end of October when the official announcement came from the Attorney General. The Silvercrest HOA is under formal state receivership pending criminal proceedings. All board members are suspended. A temporary oversight committee made up of unaffiliated homeowners and state-appointed monitors will assume operations effective immediately. The room at the town hall was so full, the fire marshal had to block new entries. Rosa was crying openly. Marcus brought a lawn chair from home just to have a seat. Kristen stood quietly in the back, arms crossed, her face unreadable. When the state monitor, a tall woman named Valerie Kwan, took the podium, she started with something I didn't expect. A moment of silence. For the homes lost, she said. The memories taken, and the voices silenced by fear. It was powerful, and it was real. Valerie continued, this HOA will not be dissolved, not yet. But its power will be reduced, its structure rebuilt from the ground up. And those who abused it will be held accountable. I wanted to cheer, but my throat wouldn't let me, because just then I thought of Lorraine. I thought of all the people who weren't in the room, people who had moved, people who had lost everything, people who may never hear this announcement or know that their quiet suffering was part of what brought this reckoning forward. And that's when I made my decision. We needed to go further. The HOA wouldn't just be rebuilt, it would be transformed. And that transformation wouldn't be done behind closed doors. That weekend, with the help of Rosa and Kristen, we launched a new website, HOAtruth.org. Its mission was simple: expose fake enforcement practices, provide legal guidance to homeowners, archive testimonies from across the state, connect victims with real attorneys, not HOA attorneys. Within 72 hours, the inbox had 600 messages. Some were short, like, they told me if I didn't remove my vegetable garden, I'd be fined $1,000 a day. I had no idea I could fight back. Some were heartbreaking. My father died, thinking he had violated some state law. We later found out it was just a notice from our HOA. Some were furious. I'm a lawyer. I used to dismiss stories like these. I won't anymore. Count me in. Ethan and Kristen developed a submission protocol. Rosa became our point of contact for Spanish-speaking residents. Marcus created a directory of trustworthy real estate attorneys in every county. It grew faster than any of us expected. And then came the phone call that told me we were truly onto something. It was from a congressman's aide. We're drafting a bill, she said. We're calling it the Residential Integrity Act. Would your team be willing to consult on what regulations could stop this from happening again? I nearly dropped the phone. I looked over at Ethan, who was sitting at my kitchen table sorting emails. He raised an eyebrow when I told him. Say yes, he said, and make sure it has teeth. Meanwhile, Carter was nowhere to be found. A bench warrant had been issued for him after he failed to appear for his preliminary hearing. Rumors flew. He had left the country. He was hiding in Florida with relatives. He was preparing to come forward with a big public statement. None of it mattered, because what he couldn't hide from was the truth already out there. His face was now synonymous with one thing: fraudulent power. And for every HOA across the country that once modeled itself after his aggressive playbook, the tide was turning. Some communities voluntarily disbanded their enforcement branches. Others rewrote their bylaws to require public votes for every infraction. And the message was clear: no more unchecked authority, no more false law, no more fear. That winter, for the first time in years, our neighborhood had no holiday enforcement letters. No citations for light displays. No warnings about wreath colors or driveway snow shoveling timing. Just houses lit up with real warmth. Children caroling without fear of noise complaints. Elderly couples walking freely, unafraid of inspections. One night, as snow fell gently outside, Ethan looked up from his laptop and said, "You realize, Dad, this all started because you didn't back down when a man waved a fake badge at you." I smiled. "No," I said. "It started because your mother taught us both to always ask, 'Says who?'" He laughed. But there was something more in that laugh now. Not just relief, but purpose. And I knew then that this wasn't just a story of justice. It was the start of a legacy. The arrest came not with sirens, but with silence. It was early January, and the sun hadn't yet melted the frost clinging to the neighborhood rooftops when Carter Voss finally ran out of places to hide. He was found in a short-term rental 3 counties over, living under the name David Collins, using a fake Florida driver's license and an expired corporate credit card issued under one of his old shell companies. When I heard, I didn't feel triumph. I felt gravity, because now it was real. Not just a reckoning in paperwork or a movement in the headlines. It was handcuffs, court dates, a name that would no longer intimidate, only disgrace. Ethan showed me the formal charges when they were released, 37 counts in total. fraud, impersonation of law enforcement, mail fraud, misuse of public seals, and criminal intimidation. The last one carried enhanced penalties due to the targeted nature of the threats, mostly against the elderly and non-English speaking residents. It was a small miracle that no one had ever suffered physically because of his schemes, but emotionally, the damage had already soaked into the walls of the homes he once ruled like a petty king. Carter didn't speak during his first hearing. His attorney did all the talking, attempting to argue that Carter believed in the righteousness of his actions, and that any violations were born of administrative misunderstanding. But the courtroom wasn't buying it, especially not with Judge Ethan Halpern presiding. Yes, my son. There had been questions about conflict of interest, and Ethan had recused himself from all matters involving the direct investigation. But once the case moved to formal arraignment and the state assigned circuit-level jurisdiction, he had no legal obligation to step aside unless challenged. Carter's team filed that motion. It was denied because Ethan didn't oversee the investigation. He was the victim, and the court saw it clearly. I watched my son from the gallery seated behind rows of neighbors, journalists, and curious citizens. He was calm, clear, and meticulous in his demeanor. Every word from the bench landed with purpose. Mr. Voss, he said, this courtroom recognizes that authority, without truth, is tyranny. You cloaked yourself in borrowed power and turned governance into intimidation. This court will now determine whether the law you once faked will now hold you accountable. There was a collective stillness in the room. And then he adjourned. Carter's face, once smug and polished, was pale and clenched. He looked not like a man in control, but a man finally forced to listen. While the court proceeded with its work, our community began something far deeper. Healing. The temporary oversight board had become permanent by unanimous vote. It now included real representation from every corner of the neighborhood. Retirees, single parents, veterans, immigrants, and yes, even 2 former board members who had bravely turned state witnesses. Their bylaws were rewritten from scratch, no longer buried in legalese or veiled threats, clear, humane, and fair. I helped review the drafts alongside Kristen, Rosa, and Marcus. We sat in my dining room sipping cocoa and laughing over how absurd the old ones had been. Look at this, Rosa said once, holding up a paper. Lawns must be mowed weekly, even during dormancy periods. What does that even mean? Marcus chuckled. It means they find you in the winter because they could. Not anymore. Spring arrived slowly that year, as if the land itself was unsure whether it was safe to bloom again. But bloom it did. Yard signs popped up. HOA reform. Now we remember ask before you enforce, but they weren't angry. They were proud. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years now stopped to chat by mailboxes. Newcomers were greeted with handshakes, not threats. And children played on sidewalks without noise violation notices pinned to their front doors. One afternoon, I saw Kristen walking with her daughter holding hands, both wearing matching sun hats. She waved across the street. Later that day, she dropped off a flyer. Neighborhood potluck and story circle, Sunday at 4 p.m. Community Center lawn. Let's tell our stories. All of them. I went, of course. We all did. We brought homemade dishes, some burnt, some brilliant, and sat on lawn chairs under paper lanterns strung between trees. There was no microphone, no moderator. Just people passing around the talking stick, one voice at a time. Some stories were funny, some were angry, some left the whole circle in tears. But all of them were honest. When it was my turn, I stood slowly. My knees cracked. I held up my old wallet badge, tattered from my military days. I've seen power used to protect. I've also seen it used to destroy, I said. But the worst thing isn't abuse. It's pretending not to see it. I turned to Ethan, who sat beside Rosa with his coat wrapped around her shoulders. This man, I said, never looked away. Even when it was his name being misused, he didn't smile. But I saw it in his eyes, the soft thanks, the quiet bond between us that no HOA, no fake cop, no printed seal could ever sever. The court would eventually sentence Carter Voss to 8 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 4. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Enough to show that no badge, fake or real, was stronger than the will of a community that finally said, enough. And that's the story I'll tell anyone who asks. Not about how they pulled me over, but about what happened when we stood up, told the truth, and refused to stay silent any longer. Not long after Carter's sentencing, the story took on a life I hadn't expected, not within our neighborhood, not even within the state, but nationally. By then, HOAtruth.org had become more than just a resource hub. It had become a rallying point, a voice for homeowners who had spent years swallowing quiet injustices behind vinyl fences and manicured lawns. One Thursday morning in late March, I opened my inbox to find an email from a producer at a major investigative news show. They wanted to feature our case in a full-length segment prime time. I almost didn't reply. It felt strange, surreal, even to turn our community's pain into something for national consumption. But then I remembered all the handwritten letters that had started pouring in, many from older residents, in mobile home parks, from veterans, from widows. People who'd written, "I didn't know this was happening to others," or "I thought I was crazy for thinking the HOA had too much power." So I called the producer back, and I said yes. The interview was filmed in Ethan's backyard, the same yard Carter once tried to fine him over for unauthorized native grass. Now it was blooming bright with color, alive with truth. We sat side by side, the cameras rolling, as Ethan calmly explained how the forged warrants had used his name, how easily systems of fear could flourish when cloaked in the illusion of law. He didn't speak like a judge that day. He spoke like a son, a neighbor, a man who'd nearly watched his father be erased from his own home by a piece of printer paper and a lie. I told the story of that first encounter on the country road, of the badge, the silence, the slow unraveling that followed, of how it wasn't my training that saved me that day. It was who stepped out of the car behind me. My wife. The segment aired a week later. Viewers across the country saw it. And then the emails came in waves, thousands of them. I wasn't just the man pulled over by a fake cop anymore. I had become something else. A symbol. I didn't want it, but I accepted it. Because symbols, when shared, can become blueprints. That spring, our little community hosted its first HOA Reform Town Hall. It wasn't just us. Representatives from 12 other communities came, some from counties away. They carried their own stories, their own scars. One woman, Amanda from Shady Oaks, had a husband with Alzheimer's who was fined $2,000 after wandering into a neighbor's yard. The HOA claimed he damaged common landscaping. She couldn't fight them. They threatened liens. Another, Luis from Pineview Glen, described being fined for parking a work van overnight in his own driveway, despite it being his only vehicle and his only income. They called it commercial pollution, he said, but it was just my livelihood. Every story chipped at something in the air. By the end of the meeting, we had agreed this wasn't just about Silvercrest. It never was. It was about something bigger. Kristen and Rosa spearheaded the next step. They drafted a policy document, 15 pages, clear language, outlining homeowner protections, transparency requirements, limits on enforcement powers, and mandatory state oversight for any association operating over a certain size. We submitted it to the office of our state representative. To our surprise, we weren't the first. 2 other districts had already started their own initiatives. And before we knew it, those separate voices became a single working group. It was Ethan who suggested the name, the Homeowner Fairness Act. Simple, clear, unapologetic. Within 6 months, it had sponsors in both the House and the Senate. By summer, it had reached committee hearings. By fall, I was standing at a podium under the gold dome of the state capitol, delivering testimony, not as a victim, not even as a retired officer, but as a citizen. HOAs were never meant to be shadow governments, I said, voice echoing through chambers. They were supposed to be stewards of shared space. But when you give power without limits, you invite corruption. And when that corruption wears a badge, real or fake, it takes more than outrage to dismantle it. It takes law. It takes resolve. And it takes remembering why we bought homes in the first place, not just for shelter, but for safety, for dignity, for peace. The applause was quiet, respectful, but it was real. And when I stepped down, I felt something unshakable. Closure. That November, the Homeowner Fairness Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Ethan sat beside me in the gallery as the final vote was cast. I didn't need to speak. We just looked at each other. The war was never about fences. It was about freedom. And we had won not with vengeance, but with vision. That Christmas, our neighborhood gathered under the same maple tree where Carter once held mandatory meetings about pet leash lengths and siding color regulations. But this time, there were no warnings, no fines, no agenda. Just neighbors, laughing. One elderly couple brought out cocoa and old photo albums. A group of kids staged a goofy play they'd written about the HOA monster, featuring cardboard badges and brooms for spears. The whole crowd laughed until they cried. Even Kristen smiled the whole time, her daughter clapping like a seal in the front row. And Ethan He sat beside me, one hand on my shoulder. "You know, Dad," he said quietly, "not everyone gets a chance to rewrite the rules that once hurt them." "No," I said, "but we did." And I thought of my wife, of the moment she stepped out of that car in uniform badge, real voice steady, making the man with the fake one shrink. She never asked for thanks, but she deserved every one of them. The morning after the final vote, I stood in my front yard with a rake in hand, staring at the hedge I'd been meaning to trim since fall. The air was crisp, December cool, with a hint of smoke from someone's fireplace, and the world felt lighter. It's a funny thing how a neighborhood can hold its breath for years without knowing. People walk their dogs, wave politely, mow their lawns, pretending the tension in their shoulders is just from work. The tight smile just a symptom of busyness. But it wasn't. It was fear. Fear of a letter, of a knock, of a badge, real or pretend. And now somehow that fear was gone. Kristen wandered by, coffee in hand, her daughter riding a scooter that glittered in the weak winter sun. She stopped and pointed to the side of my house. "You're taking the fence down." I hadn't decided until that moment. "Yeah," I said, "I think I am." The wooden slats that had once marked my boundary didn't feel like protection anymore. They felt like silence, like we were all hiding from each other. And the thing is, when you stop hiding, you want the world to know it. So I pried the first board loose, and then the next. And by the time I reached the final panel, Rosa was helping too, muttering something about how fences were a metaphor for HOA-induced trauma. She wasn't wrong. When it was done, I stood back and looked across my yard, now merging seamlessly with Marcus's. He waved from his porch, raised a beer in salute. "You always had the better grass," he said, grinning. I shrugged. "Maybe now you'll start mowing it for me." We laughed. That night, our newly formed neighborhood committee gathered not in a meeting hall, not under an agenda, but around my fire pit. Someone brought chili. Someone else brought cornbread. Someone set up a Bluetooth speaker playing soft jazz, which eventually gave way to Motown, which led to dancing. Yes, dancing. Because why not? We weren't just a neighborhood anymore. We were a community. And communities, I learned, are not built by architecture, but by accountability. Not by fences, but by connection. Not by fear, but by knowing that if someone shows up waving a fake badge again, 10 doors will open and say, "Not here. Not ever again." A few months later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name in ink that looked hesitant, almost nervous. Inside was a single page, typed, formal, no signature. I don't know why I did it, not really. Maybe I liked the power. Maybe I thought no one would ever stop me, but you did. You and your wife and your son. You didn't humiliate me. You didn't attack. You exposed the truth. I have a long time to think about that now. And maybe that's good. Maybe for the first time, I'll become something more than what I pretended to be. I'm sorry for all of it. I folded the letter slowly and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, not for revenge, not for memory, but for grace. Because even villains sometimes break under the weight of the very lies they build. Ethan visits more now, not just as a son, but as a neighbor. He bought the house 2 doors down from mine. Said it was for the backyard, but I know it was something deeper. A coming home, maybe. He and Rosa are planning a wedding in the spring. My wife would have loved her. That quiet kindness, that fire under gentleness. The night they told me, we sat on my porch, the stars overhead like scattered glass. Ethan asked, "Do you ever regret it, staying and fighting?" I didn't have to think. Not once. Because this stretch of land and trees and laughter, this wasn't just home. It was victory. A quiet, earned, and lasting victory. Sometimes people still recognize me. They ask, "Were you really the guy with the fake HOA cop?" And I smile, not offer the sanitized version of the vents. But if they really want to know, if they ask the second question, what happened next, I tell them, the badge didn't win. The truth did. And in the end, we didn't just take back our street. We took back our story. And that was worth every board I tore down. Every law we rewrote. Every long silent year that led us to a single undeniable word. Enough!